So I've gone to now a couple conferences, a couple linguistics conferences on idioms, and two that you are going to hear at every conference on the syntax or semantics of idioms are kick the bucket and spill the beans. And the reason that you talk about these so much is that they have interesting properties. They work differently in the English language. And so I want to start off by talking about their origins. Where did they come from? Where did we get these phrases? Idioms are no exception in the larger scheme of language historical change, where meanings shift. Meanings shift as people get creative with language and they use things in more metaphorical ways. This is called desemanticization. And idioms are no different than this. It's just that this happens at a phrase level larger than just single words. And so, kick the bucket and spill the beans have gotten their meanings from things that originally had nothing to do with their meanings that we use them for today. So, kick the bucket comes to us from French. It's not an English idiom. Uh, in 16th century France, they used to slaughter animals by hanging them up on a wooden frame. And this wooden frame was called a bouquet. So kick the bucket has nothing to do with what some people in Pennsylvania and other regions of eastern United States would call a pail. It has nothing to do with this thing that you hold water in. It's actually a wooden frame that you would hang up animals to slaughter them on. And so this thing was called a bouquet. You might know from your Age of Empires days the siege weapon called a trebuchet. It's the same root, trebuchet. In old French used to be pronounced trebuchet, kind of with the hard sound. And it's the same thing. It's the same frame root that we use for this idiom, kick the bucket. And so it's easy to imagine when we were slaughtering these animals, they would spasm in their death throes and they would probably kick the bouquet. And so that was just calqued or translated word for word over into English, borrowed into English. In English, we use, and that's how we got the phrase today. In English, we use a lot of phrases from France dealing with food or animals. So all our food words like beef, bœuf, pork, porc, come directly from French in this way. And the idiom is exactly the same way. Spill the beans does not come from French. We're happy to say that this is an original English idiom. And originally it had nothing to do with secrets. So spill the beans today in contemporary American English means to divulge a secret. But in its original usage, the first mentions of it were in the 1900s. The first mentions of it were having to do with sports activities, so baseball and horse racing, which were really big back then. The beans were spilled meant that like a second place horse would come up at the very last minute and spill the beans. It would upset the apple cart. It would kind of, it was just an upset, right? And so that's where spill the beans comes from. It actually meant like an upset in sports, an unexpected outcome, or the underdog won in the end. And interestingly, back then it was almost exclusively used in its passive form. So in all these newspaper articles where we see this idiom come up in sports reporting, it was always the beans were spilled. So interestingly, we see that difference in the earliest documentation of this. Oh, and then later it has to be mentioned. So later, of course, transitioning from talking about the underdog winning in a sport, it became known today as yeah, like get rid of the secret because it's going to upset the people if they know that she's pregnant or something like that. So okay, but why are these always interested? Back to my linguistic point, why are these always talked about in linguistics? They behave differently when you do things to them in sentences. What do you mean do things to them? What happens when you passivize the two? Remember what passive voice is? You're told in English class not to use passive. Can you say the beans were spilled by John to mean that John divulged a secret? I think you totally can. If you say that, the beans were divulged by John, it means that he's a total blabbermouth. And so what we say is that that idiom is decomposable. You're allowed to put it in a passive voice. You're allowed to make it, you're allowed to switch the words around and do things to it. Whereas, let's contrast that with kick the bucket. Can you say kick the bucket in passive tense? The bucket was kicked by John. Did John die? I don't think so. I don't think so. And this is what we study. This is what I study in linguistics. That particular idioms do different things. They are restricted in this way. And more importantly, what we're really interested in is how you know that. Like many things in linguistics, you were never taught, I assure you, that, all of you listeners who went to 20 years of schooling, public schooling, or whatever in the US, you were never taught that you cannot passivize this idiom, kick the bucket. But for some reason, there is some underlying principle in our language learning mechanism in our brain that has endowed us with this knowledge. And that's what we're interested in studying. And that's what I'm interested in studying in linguistics, the syntax of idioms. Why is it that some you can passivize and some that you can't? And more importantly, how did we all learn that as native English speakers? So future directions are pretty clear. I think looking at just a large number of idioms, there are tons of studies done on classifying idioms into different categories based on how much transformations you can do to them, and also cross-linguistic. So languages behave differently. No surprise here. Languages have different types of idioms, and it would be very interested to see if these generalizations hold across languages, because that's where we really get explanatory power.